sessions. Fabulous to have you all join. Yanni, I'm sure you're going to come on now. Yanni, come in. Morning, Tinas.
Good morning. Sorry about that.
Yes, he is. There we go. Hi, Yanni.
Hi there. Sorry about that.
No problem. Is there a presentation, Yanni? Do I need to
I
bring
did
it
not.
up?
I did not prepare a presentation for today because it's general.
Okay.
A look at your general contract and a few things that has popped up now. In the last few months with regards to FICA requirements and so forth. Yeah. So it's
Perfect.
basically a
Well,
general discussion. Yeah.
Yanni, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you so much again for handling some of these sessions for us. We really appreciate you. And I'm going to let you speak your words of wisdom.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michelle, and thank you, Leapfrog, for the opportunity to assist you with the training again. Obviously, as you could see from the memo that was sent through, the training will be with regards to your information sheet, the completion thereof. I'll also touch on the condition that you have to require proof of funds from your clients. And then I will look at the latest court case with regards to defects in a property. That court case was now in February, so it's very interesting for us to have a look at that. Let's start with the information sheet that you guys have to complete at the back of your offer to purchase. Now, guys, this is a very important document. It's just as important as your commission clause. Because if you don't complete this correctly, you won't get paid at the end of the day. And the reason why I say that is that the mortgage originators, the banks, as well as the legal fraternity, being us as attorneys, will have a look at that, and we will require that information in order to proceed with the transaction. So if you're going to complete the information sheet and you're not going to do it properly, not all the relevant information will reach the bank, and the bond might be granted incorrectly. And I'll give you an example of that. So if I've got one of the Leapfrog offers in front of me now, and it says marital status, and it's only completed as married. Now, as you guys know, there's a few marital statuses within South Africa. We've got customary marriage. We have marriage in terms of the law, the Muslim rights. We have marriages in terms of Hindu rights. We have marriage in committed property. We have marriage out of committed property. So just to stipulate that a client is married is not completing of the information correctly. So in that instance now, what's going to happen is the bank is going to grant and offer a bond to only one of your purchases because they're going to assume that either the party is married out of committed property or they are married unmarried. And then you're going to have a situation where if it's a marriage in committed property, both of your parties, being the husband and the wife, had to sign the relevant offer to purchase, and now you only have one of your parties to the contract, and that will make your contract invalid, and there goes your commission. So it's very important to please complete the information correctly, specifically the marriages clause, to make sure that you ask the right questions. And this links in with the FICA Act. I know we have to constantly, we refer to FICA, and everybody's a bit upset about that at the moment. But if you look at Section 21A of the Act, it says that it sets out the information required by all accountable institutions, and this must be obtained when engaging into a prospective business relationship with a client. So it's not might be obtained, it must be obtained. And then they go on to stipulate when an accountable institution engages with a prospective client to establish a business relationship, in terms of Section 21, and it also stipulates the steps and so forth, but then it says you must inquire about the client's personal information. So you must obtain that. And for a client to say to you that it is preferent information, or it is privileged, or it's private, unfortunately, that's not going to cut it. Even the POPI Act rates second to the FICA Act. So if a client says to you that I'm not going to give you any information because I deem it as private, then automatically that should bring up suspicion on your part, and you must insist on getting the information. Alternatively, you can't proceed with that transaction. So please make sure that you obtain the relevant information from your clients, full names, ID numbers, copies of their IDs, as well as their marital statuses. And, if it's always better to obtain the tax details already at that stage, because it's part of the client's identity. Right. To link into that, I'm going to also then look at the condition that's in some of your offer to purchases that says the source of funds, and then there's a little line where you have to complete where the source of funds come from. And again, a lot of clients say to you that this is private information, I'm not going to provide this to you. Unfortunately, again, you can refer the client to section 21A, specifically small c of the Act, which stipulates as part of the information that you have to obtain from your client, the source of funds which that prospective client expects to use in conclusion of the transaction in the course of the business relationship concerned. So that's specified in the Act. So not obtaining the information from the client, you are transgressing the FICA legislation, and that's going to result in a huge fine, alternatively imprisonment if the fine can't be paid. And it's something that can be avoided by a simple question that is asked. And now you have the section of the Act that actually stipulates that you can obtain that from the client, and you don't have to be worried that when a client says to you that it's privileged information, you can say, I understand that it's privileged, but remember, in terms of the FICA legislation, specifically clause 21AC, I have to obtain this from you. It's always nice if it's a bond that the client's going to require, because then you can just say 100% bond, so the source of funds will be from the bond. And if he's paying his costs, he will have to describe to you where he's going to be getting his costs. If it is from a savings account, then he will have to provide you with proof of that savings account where the funds come from. This also links in with your RMCP, being your risk assessment, your risk management and compliance program. So if your risk management and compliance program stipulates that you will obtain proof of funds from the client, again, FIC is going to penalize you for not following your own RMCP. And that is one of the reasons why it is inserted in your offer to purchase, to make sure that you actually go through the offer clause by clause and obtain the relevant information from the client to make sure that you do not get penalized from FIC. I've got a few examples for you as to what will be acceptable as proof of funds. And as I said to you, if the client says, I am getting it from my savings, then the client has to provide you with a copy of that savings bank statement. We normally require that that statement must be for at least 3 months, because you want to see that the funds were available in that 3 months. Alternatively, confirmation that the client was making a small savings of R1,000 a month or R500 a month that has now accumulated to his R100,000 cost that he has to pay for the purchase of his property. Also, if it's transferred from another bank, and this also happens where the client gives you a bank statement that shows he's got R100,000 in the account, but you can see on that statement that there was a transfer of R100,000 or R90,000 a few days before from another account. The information that you will have to then obtain will be for that account as well, because the funds come from a different account, not necessarily only from the one account that the client gives you the statement on. The reason why that is important, just to give you an example. So X is purchasing the property and Y transfers the money into the account, and now X transfers the money out of his account over into the attorney's trust account. It then, without verifying who Y is, there's a possibility that there can be a money laundering or a terrorist activity happening there, and they are basically putting the money from Y's account, which was corrupt, into X's account, and X then buys the property. So that's why it's important for you to know, if the money is not paid by the specific purchaser, who is paying the funds and why is that person making payment of the funds. To add into the why, if the client says to you that it's business income or profits, you will obviously have to provide you with the business bank statements as well as the financial statements of the business. If it's from an investment, we've already covered that, very much similar to this, to the savings, where you will have to provide you with confirmation from the investment property. And then if it's from a sale of a property, so in other words, the purchaser has now sold his property, the money is already in the other attorney's trust account. So that transaction has happened. The funds are available, not one where it's still subject to him selling the property. But in this instance, the funds are already available. Then you're going to have to require a letter from the conveyancer that did that transaction to confirm that the funds were transferred to the client's account, maybe a copy of the final statement of account that matches up with the funds that we received. And you will also then have to obtain a copy of that offer to purchase. The seller has signed sold the property that belongs to him. So those are just a few examples that you will get to deal with more often. The other examples like winnings, trust donations, pension funds, provident funds, insurance payments, all of those, just by the sound of it and by considering what I've just mentioned to you now with regards to savings and investments, you're going to have to inquire as to why those funds were paid over to the client, and then obtain the relevant information that substantiates that payment that was made to the client in order for you to actually fulfill the source of funds obligations that's upon you. Remember as well that it's not your part to question those the information that's provided to you by the client. So if the client gives you the bank statement and he gives you the confirmation as to where it comes from, you don't have to now phone, for argument's sake, the attorney that did the transfer and find out whether the transfer did in fact happen, and was he the conveyancer, and does he know the client. That is not up to you to actually do. You can take the documentation at face value and accept that is the true situation. If there is any suspicion, please do speak to your money laundering officer in your office, and he will then have to file a suspicious transaction report. You only stop then with the transaction, obviously, once FIC advises you to stop. But if it is a situation where you know that the money is fraudulent, then you should not actually continue with the transaction at all, and you must still report the matter to FIC, even if no payment was made in the instance. Right. So the last issue that I'm going to be dealing with is the recent decision that was given by the High Court. It was an appeal from the local division. The matter was Cole versus, or in the appeal court now, was Cole versus Talakar Holdings. Cole was, in the initial instance, the purchaser, and he purchased the property from the seller for a nice purchase price, and the agent was smiling all the way to the bank because the purchase price, the property was originally marketed for 150 million rand, and then an offer was accepted for 135 million rand. The purchaser wrote a clause in the contract, and I'm going to read you specific instances from the judgment just so that you can understand how the court was looking at the matter, and also to give you a better perspective of the case itself. So in this instance, the purchaser wrote in clause 20.2, he wrote, the purchaser at his own expense will conduct an inspection of the home within 14 days of acceptance of the offer. Should there be a structural defect or defects that are unacceptable to the purchaser, then the purchaser can, at his discretion, elect to cancel the agreement. So at face value, that clause looks very reasonable, and everybody interpreted the clause to be reasonable. Then on the the purchaser then did his inspection. He had Investec Bank there. Sorry about that. He had Investec Bank at the property to evaluate the property. He also had a structural engineer at the property. And then on the 25th of November, 5 days after the offer was signed, his attorney sent through a letter to the agent saying that unfortunately, after conducting due diligence, the purchaser hereby elects to cancel the agreement. Good luck with this sale. Obviously, immediately that letter was sent through to the agent, to the seller, And the seller's attorneys then on the 6th of December sent a letter of demand to the purchaser to make payment of the full purchase price, failing which the respondent would proceed with an application for specific performance of the agreement. So you can see that there was no acceptance of the cancellation by the seller. Then between the 20th and the 24th of December, various emails were exchanged between the purchaser and the estate agent, and the purchaser then requested to have additional valuators there, again from Investec Bank, as well as from Sage Limited, and as well as evaluators there at the property. The valuation was submitted on the 14th of January 2022, and that valuation was obviously rejected. Then on the 15th of January, a few days later, basically nearly a month after the offer was cancelled, a month and a bit, the purchaser then contacted the agent and said, listen, I'm still interested in this property. I want to look at maybe putting another offer in. Can you send me a blank offer to purchase? So the agent on the 15th of January sent through a blank offer to purchase, which was completed by the purchaser and sent back to the agent on the 20th of January. But now they've changed the terms in the sense that the purchase price is no longer 135 million, but only 100 million. There was going to be a 30 million deposit, and the balance was going to be secured by a bond from Investec. Before this offer could even be submitted to the seller, being the 21st of January, a day later, the purchaser then sent another email to the agent saying, okay, well, I've changed my mind. I now no longer want to proceed with this offer to purchase. So the seller then instituted action immediately on the 11th of March for specific performance, and the court is now there to assess what the situation is with regards to this offer to purchase. So the purchaser relied on three issues. Firstly, he said that the agreement was void because there was no consensus as to what was interpreted by clause 20.2, that clause that said that he can at any stage cancel if if there's any defects in the property. So he says there wasn't a meeting of the minds as to exactly what that meant. His second contention was that the agreement was the cancellation of the agreement was accepted by the seller the minute the agent sent through the second offer to purchase, the blank offer, which they could then negotiate a new contract. And his third defense was that the agreement was lawfully terminated by him when he sent through his notification on the 25th of November. So the court then went and they looked at the three defenses by the purchaser. And the first was obviously that the agreement was void. So here the court had to specifically look at that clause that says structural defects or any defects that is unacceptable to the purchaser. So the purchaser contended that that there was no consequence between the two clauses, and that obviously he can cancel either if there's structural damage or defects in the property or any other defect that he seems fit. This is explained obviously very nicely by the court when they attach the emails that was exchanged between the seller and the purchaser's attorney on the night of the 25th after cancellation. So I'll give you the times as well to show you that it was an after-hours situation where 5 minutes past 8 in the evening, the purchaser's attorney confirmed to the seller that in terms of clause 20.2, the purchaser hereby elects to cancel the agreement. Put simply, the purchaser believes that there are defects which the purchaser views as unreasonable and unacceptable. The seller then replied at 14 minutes past 8 to say that clause 20.2 is not open-ended. I require a copy of the report to confirm that it is compliant under clause 20.2. The agreement remains binding and subject to this confirmation. 20 minutes to 9, the seller's attorney again replied to say that the purchaser does not believe that you have the right to request the inspection and the information you seek. The purchaser believes that there is unacceptable defects. Such wording is subjective, and the purchaser is beholden on the seller to accept the same. Furthermore, given the wording at his discretion to cancel, this discretion means any discretion, not in the hands of the seller. Your attorney will no doubt inform you that the agreement was repudiated by the purchaser, you've got two options: either accept it or accept the repudiation or reject the repudiation. The seller then replied to say that the interpretation is incorrect, that it is structural issues and not any issues. He would never have signed the contract if it was for a non-disclosure or a report that's going to refer to any other issues other than the structural issues. And then a lot of other emails were exchanged. Interesting is that at 1 minute to 10 that evening, the attorney sent an email again to say that by definition, defect means an imperfection, given that the purchaser had the choice. For all intents and purposes, he could have decided that in his view, the color of the grass was not perfect. Of course, that is not the case, but it does illustrate the point. I do not wish to labor this point. I believe that this clarifies the purchaser's position. Good luck with your sale. The purchaser then replied at 7 minutes to 11 at night. The seller replied, your absurd example would only be relevant if the agreement allowed total discretion, which would effectively have given the purchaser a free option. This is not the case. It was specifically agreed, as reflected in the agreement, that the discretion only applies to structural defect. Grass cannot be a structural defect. I only agreed to that condition because of my confidence that there will be no identified structural defects, which I believe is the actual position. The agreement remains valid unless your client demonstrates a genuine structural defect to which he applied his discretion. Clause 20.2 would make no sense otherwise. The court then had a look at, obviously, as I said, all the correspondence were taken into account, and they came to the conclusion that the pleadings by the parties did describe the full contents of what the agreement was. The purchaser was arguing that there was no meeting of the minds of that clause because the seller's interpretation is that it will only be structural defects, where the purchaser says that his interpretation is that it is structural defects or any other defect, no matter how immaterial it might seem. The court then confirmed that there was a meeting of the minds when the clause was actually inserted in the contract. And that is where the meeting of the minds occurred. So both parties agreed that that clause can be inserted into the contract. The court says that the interpretation of that clause is a dispute that only happened after the contract was already signed. So there couldn't have been a misinterpretation by any party when the contract was signed with regards to the interpretation of that clause, because the interpretation issues only started to materialize after the contract was actually cancelled in those emails that I have read out to you. So the court then says that on their own interpretation, the only real dispute between the parties, both then, in other words, when the contract was signed, as well as now in front of the court, is a post-contractual disagreement over the interpretation of a clause. The second, so the purchaser failed on his first defense. The second defense, as I said to you, was the respondent accepted the cancellation because the agent sent through another offer. The court then again referred to the email correspondence and confirmed that the seller repeatedly stated in his correspondence on the 25th that the cancellation was not accepted. You would also remember from what I read to you, he referred to the clause in the contract. He referred to the fact that the contract was not open-ended. He referred to the fact that until he sees that there is structural problems, there will be no cancellation accepted on his part. So even on the second offense, the court found that the purchaser did not prove his case. With regard to the third defense, and this is what's very important to us as well, the third defense being the lawful cancellation of the contract. The court looked at the heart of his defense lies in interpretation of the clause. So where the purchaser was entitled to cancel on two grounds, structural defects or defects deemed acceptable to him, the court, however, saw that these defects must be not a subjective test, but an objective test. So the purchaser made it a subjective test. So in other words, anything that he deems is not sufficient can lead to the cancellation of the contract and gives him the right to cancel the contract, where the seller's interpretation was that it's subjective. In other words, you must give me a reasonable man's perspective on the issue. The court actually also found that it must be reasonable and not subjective only to the purchaser. And the fact that the purchaser did not disclose any defects, he refused to share the defect report with the seller, the structural engineer's report, or the valuations done by the bank. And only 5 months after the matter, in his founding papers, or sorry, his replying papers, did he actually mention the following items. Very interesting. He says he noticed a few cracks in the property walls during the inspection on the 18th of November. Additionally, he raised concerns, including the desire to lay a new paving at the front door. He wanted to widen the entrance, the driveway entrance, and construct a second entrance at the driveway. He wanted to remodel the kitchen, install an elevator to access all 3 floors of the property, and he wanted to build a ramp from the garage to the front entrance. The court then looked at these specific items mentioned by the purchaser and says that that it is not material to the actual entire property. It does not infect the entire property. The court then looked at the meaning of defect, and it's ascertained requiring existing evidence, but obviously then also look at the interpretation. And the court says the ordinary meaning of a defect is an abnormal quality or attribute of the property sold that destroys or substantially impairs its ultimately or effectiveness. For this purpose, for which it is generally used, or unfit for the special use that it was purchased. The purchaser's subjective interpretation is irrelevant. The test is objective. Even the so-called defect cited by the purchaser pertains to potential taste and preference rather than an actual defect. The court goes on to say the purchaser's claim that he was entitled to withdraw from the agreement based on any minor imperfection in the property because it does not fulfill his personal needs at his sole discretion and without proof is thus unsustainable. This interpretation stretches the meaning of defect to the point of triviality. Under the appellant's reasoning, the appellant being the purchaser, any defect, whether latent or patent, material or inconsequential, would grant him the right to cancel an agreement. Such an approach is inconsistent with our basic common sense and is not reasonable. So on that cancellation, the court then said, no, sorry, Mr. Purchaser, you are unfortunately bound by the contract, and specific performance was granted. So it's a very interesting case for us all to take into account on how the courts actually look at the interpretation of what is a defect. And you will see that it must be a material defect and it must affect the whole cause, in other words, the whole property. So to use a stupid example, the garage motor that does not work and the purchaser now wants to withdraw from the contract, unfortunately, he will not be allowed in terms of this court decision, as it is not so material to affect the use of the whole property. He might still have a damages claim against the seller if it wasn't disclosed, but it is not up for cancellation of the contract. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Is there any questions? Okay, Tinus wants to know what would a court case like this cost? Well, Tinus, to give you an example, in this instance, both attorney firms had advocates, and not just a normal advocate. It was a silk, we call it a silk. And those attorneys charged by the minute. So this would have most probably be about a 200 to a 250,000 Rand court case to fight. If you look at the value of the property being 135 million, you can understand why 200,000 Rand is not a lot of money if you look at the 135 million purchase price. But if you look at a 100,000 rand purchase price, 200,000 rand is quite a bit to spend. We hope, obviously, now that attorneys looking at representing purchasers to try and cancel contracts will have this court case in mind when they advise the purchaser, so that there won't be necessity for litigation to occur. Okay, any other questions, guys? Okay, cool.
Thank you,
Thank
Jannie.
you.
That was very interesting. Quite a lot of money involved there, I must say. It's quite a purchase price, even by Cape Town standards.
And this, I'm proud to say, this was a Joburg property. So where, Cape Town?
Wow.
Yeah.
That was a lot of money. Anyway, thank you, Jannie. Very, very interesting, especially as you say about the defects. So very interesting. Thank you for your input.
100%, guys. Enjoy the day.
Cheers, Jannie.